How's it going, guys? It's Eclipse here, and today's video we're looking at the next tank line to come into World of Tanks console. This has been confirmed by Wargaming. They've said that this is what is coming in, and that is in the form of the Italian heavy tanks. These are ones that come in at tier 7 with the Carro Solto P88, and then move up to the tier 10 Rinocerante, and then they also have a premium tier 8 Italian heavy tank as well. That we'll get into. So I think the best place to start in terms of these tanks is obviously with the premium tank, which will actually come in probably before the Italian heavies come into the game. That's what they usually do. First they'll give you a taste with the premium tank, and then they'll move on and release the other tanks similar to that of the Polish mediums when they came into the game. I expect that that will be the same for the Italian heavies. So what is the Bisante? Basically, the Bisante has a interesting mechanic in terms of it's an autoloader, which basically what happens is you can reload one shell, fire off that shell, and then also reload another one. So it's a case of like, yeah, you have a 3 clip, but you can also fire one of that clip, and then it will reload that shell back into your magazine. So instead of an autoloader where once you've fired one of those clip shells, that's it. You cannot reload. What happens with this is it will actually reload that shell back into the magazine, say if you only could get one shot off. So that's where it's interesting in terms of how you can play it in game. That's where they kind of sacrifice the DPM that these do have comparatively to the other autoloaders at the tier. And that's why, you know, you'll be able to play them a bit more aggressively than an autoloader. You can actually poke out, you can take shots where you're only able to fire one, you know, instead of having to save those shells into a bursty magazine and fire them all off. You do have the potential to just fire them in a single fire fashion. Although it is better for your DPM to actually fire off all of them in one go. You know, because what happens is the first shell is always the cheapest to reload. So you have on the Bisante right here, you'll see that it has an 11.51 second reload for the first shell. Then when you reload the second shell, it takes 14 seconds. So that's an extra 2.8 seconds. And then for the third shell in the magazine, it takes 16.3 seconds. So if you are going to fire this like a single shot, you'd want to be firing it in a single shot and not actually reloading the other shells, so literally firing off as many as possible straight away. But if you do only fire a single shot when you're fully reloaded, you're going to be dealing you're going to have a reload of 16.3 seconds. You're only going to be able to get off just under 4 rounds a minute comparatively to the 5.21. So, you know, you can't really compare rate of fire in these tanks because technically you won't have a consistent rate of fire throughout the whole game, depending on how much you're firing, when you're firing, and it kind of gives that whole new aspect in terms of an auto reloader. It's not like the medium tanks, which I think that they actually have the longest reload to begin with, and then that it gets shorter over the clip. This one actually gets worse over the clip, so it's a little bit different from the medium tanks on the Italian line, if I am correct in thinking that. Now, in terms of the Bisante, what's special about this one? This is actually basically a better version of the tier 8. We will do a little comparison when we get to the tier 8 tech tree one, but as a premium, this is actually not that bad on PC. I think that, you know, we've got these statistics from the PC version because they've already come out, and I'm assuming that the statistics will be fairly similar to that of the PC, so we'll take it as that. And what playstyle would you be using in the Bisante? Well, basically you want to be a clipper, so you do want to reload to your maximum amount possible and then fire them off all at the same time. But then it is also useful to be able to then use that single shot when you need to. If someone pokes around and you're only one shell loaded, then you can fire it off. And they're going to be scared probably because they realise that you're a auto reloader, and then they'll probably back off. So it's kind of one of those situations where it's up to you when you fire, and you know it depends on the situation, so they're kind of flexible a little bit, but they can also be inflexible in terms of if you're 2 seconds away from reloading that third shell and you have to fire, it will reset that shell back to 0 on the reload. So it's really important that sometimes you have to wait those extra 2 seconds, even though you could have got a shot off. It really is a bit of a calculated sort of tank that you have to play. Now, in terms of what the Bisante is like to be able to play in game, well, you actually have really nice turret armor on a tier 8. You know, you're looking, if they manage to hit the spaced armor of this thing at 300 in places, but overall you're probably looking at about 240 millimeters of penetration. You should note though, because it is spaced armor, it means it's got better protection against heat rounds. So you'll see a lot of heat rounds will actually get absorbed into the turret, and you need a lot more penetration than your standard rounds in order to go through the spaced armor and the turret behind it. So be aware that the turret of this thing on the tier 8 premium is actually really decent for a tier 8 anyway. Not a lot of tier 8s will have penetration to just be able to auto aim your turret or just fling around and shoot you in the turret and pen you. But you should note, you know, tier 10s are most likely going to be able to go through you if they actually aim. The weakest point is this kind of bar here, where the armor is flattest on the turret, either side of the mantlet, which is this big area here on the tank. And the hull armor is pretty weak, I'm not going to lie. If you expose any of your hull, you'll pretty much get penned by anyone. You know, you've only got 135 millimeters of actual armor, and then you've got some spaced on top of that, which makes the upper plate about 200 millimeters of armor and the lower plate absolutely terrible at only 120. But it is quite small, so hitting the lower plate isn't the easiest job that you'll have. The one good thing about the Italian heavies is they're so good on ridgeline, so you can see what the turret armor is like here. It goes up to 430 if anyone hits around your mantlet area, and the weakest point on it is about 273 millimeters, which is actually really good. You will only want to be coming up against these things if you're in something with a massive gun, something that has ridiculous penetration. You know, you're looking at your Jaegeroos trying to pen this turret. It's actually not bad, and certainly TDs with high alpha and high penetration will be able to go through this. But for the majority of situations where you're fighting on a ridgeline against other mediums, you'll have a good time against them. Now obviously you can expose your lower plate if you go up too much, but this is the sort of angle you want to be using your tank at, using that 10 degrees of gun depression, which this tank does get the decent turret to be able to have really nice games. Certainly the side armor is terrible, so you don't want to be side scraping in this thing. It really doesn't have too much. You know, you've only got 75 millimeters of armor on the side, so I guess if you side scrape at an extreme angle, you will be able to side scrape against some tanks, but be aware if you over angle too much, you will literally just get penned if they don't hit your tracks. So yeah, be careful of that if you're going to try and side scrape in this tank, because I really wouldn't recommend it against a lot of people. So, you know, you really need a steep angle if you're going to do that. But other than that, for the Bisante, your DPM's actually fairly decent for a Italian heavy tank. When you compare it to the tier 8 in the tech tree, you get an extra 300 DPM, you get extra alpha damage, you've got better rate of fire, you've got a lower intra-clip reload of only 3 seconds instead of 3.5 seconds. And yeah, you can definitely have some really good games in this thing. 1080 alpha in the clip, it takes 6 seconds to do that 1080 alpha, and so you can take off most of the enemy's hit points in one foul sweep of 6 seconds, comparatively to a normal tank that would only deal 360 in one shot. Now, do I recommend picking this premium tank up? On PC it costs 10,200 gold. On console I don't know how much it will actually cost. I think it could be around there, 10,000. It'll probably be part of the season pass, so you can probably pick it up for an extra amount. The season pass is usually 11,500 for the ultimate one, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's part of that and you pick it up at the start of the next season. Don't know if it will be at the start of next season, but I did think that that's probably where we're going with the Italian heavy tanks. Your view range in this thing is actually really decent at 380 meters, means you can boost that up with some of the perks and also some equipment if you really want to be a spotting tank, so it can actually be fairly decent. So I would recommend that if you do fancy spotting and getting some spotting assistance damage at tier 8. You have a decent top speed as well of 50 kilometers an hour, which is really, really nice. You can definitely use that to get around the map, use that with your view range to be able to spot tanks, and use your gun depression to get into positions on ridge lines where it really benefits your tank. Now, in terms of accuracy, you're looking at a 2.59 second aim time, which is meh. It's alright. You've got a 0.4 dispersion, and then you've got some pretty alright, I guess, on the move. So on console, obviously we have a lot more accuracy perks that can just boost your accuracy on the move, which this tank probably will need in order to make it as accurate as possible, because that DPM is that poor on this thing. Now moving on to the bit of the video that probably everyone's most interested in, and that is the tech tree line of the Italian heavies. So basically they come in at tier 7 with the Carro Solto P88 that comes off of the P43 bis. So if you're interested in grinding out some XP in order to be able to purchase this tank straight away when it gets dropped into the game, we don't know when that will be exactly, but I would guess around 2 weeks after the start of the next season potentially, but don't quote me on that. It could be different, not entirely sure. So I think it will be fairly soon. Maybe it will be start of summer. You could be looking at early June or late May in terms of when this will come out. Personally, that's what I think. Obviously, we've got the P43 bis. Get yourself about 60,000 free XP on it, or just XP on the tank, and you can pick this tank up straight away. And basically, we'll go over what the key things of this are. It's got slightly less DPM than the tier 8, obviously the tier 8 premium. This thing gets a 240 damage. It doesn't get the auto reloader, it gets a single shotgun, which I guess for most of you is probably actually better. I mean, with this thing you could potentially feasibly use the worst gun because it has way better DPM. The only problem is the penetration, but if you fire premium rounds, I expect you'll actually be fine. 198mm of penetration, which is decent for tier 7, and I think for the boost of DPM that this tank gets with the smaller gun is actually worth it. You also get better dispersion, aim time, and obviously the reload time's better. So I think using the worst gun is probably your better option on this thing, although you do get worse penetration. So kind of it's up to you as to what you're going to do with that. Now this tank is fairly slow. It goes 35 kilometers an hour, not particularly very fast. You're going to be very slow. Do I think that this tank is going to be super overpowered at tier 7? Absolutely not. I don't think that this is going to be anything special. You don't particularly get an amazing amount of gun depression. You only get 8 degrees, which is similar to a lot of mediums at that tier. You get pretty poor view range, 350 meters. You're not going to be a light tank at this tier, so spotting damage isn't going to be necessarily something that you can go out and grab. You can have a decent amount though, like if you boost that up to 400 meters with various perks, you're looking at situational awareness and a couple of other things. You can have some good games in it. The armor of the tank is weak. I'm not gonna lie, it's weak. Most tier 7s are just gonna go straight through your upper plate, which is looking at around 180mm to 175mm of effective armor. So you need that sort of penetration to go through the upper plate. Don't shoot the lower plate because it is just that well angled and you can barely see it. So just fire at the upper plate. Additionally, you can pen through the turret, which has terrible armor outside the mantlet. So, that's always a choice, but you want to be aiming for this lower part, just to the side of the mantlet. Don't go shooting this really well angled bit because it will probably just bounce off. In terms of side armour, you have none, basically. You don't really have any. Even through the tracks, you've basically got not a lot. And then from the rear, you are paper. You can literally get penned by pretty much everyone's HE rounds. So if you want to fire some HE, then you can fire those through the back of the tank. You know, you've got plenty enough penetration to go through with your HE. So whether this tank is actually worth it in terms of playing it, maybe 3 marking it, personally I don't think this is going to be one that I'm going to be focusing on, and I think it will get out of my garage straight away as soon as I get the tier 8. Now talking about the tier 8, we'll move on. We've got the Progetto C55 mod 54. So this tank it's kind of average, to be honest with you. You know, you get really poor DPM for a tier 8. You've got 1550 DPM. You have that auto reloading mechanic like we talked about with the Bisante. This tank is kind of like a worse version of the Bisante. So you're slower. You've got a top speed of 45 kilometers an hour. You've got worse DPM. You've got smaller alpha damage. You've got a worse rate of fire. Although it should be noted that the reload time for each of the shells is actually smaller as you get on in the clip. So all of the time is actually slower, but you do get an increase in your intra-clip reload of 0.5 of a second, which is actually quite important in terms of retracking people or keeping them pinned down. So that's also important to think about. Now in terms of you know, your speed, you probably can shift about, but you're not going to be too fast, and it probably takes quite a little bit of time to actually get over up to that top speed. You know, when you compare it to the Bisante, it does have better power to weight, which means your acceleration will probably be better, but it's still not amazing, and you certainly aren't going to be racing into position in this thing. In terms of gun depression, it gets 9 degrees, whereas the Bisante gets 10 degrees. It's that classic case of a premium that's better than the tech tree tanks, to be honest. With the Bisante, you get worse view range, of course, by 10 meters, so you're going to get outspotted by the Bisante. You've got the same amount of hit points, if I'm rightly, or you get 50 more hit points, so that makes a world of a difference. So yeah, I think that this tank will probably be a little bit better to handle. So you've got better power to weight, you've got better traverse speed compared to the Bisante, but you do sacrifice that gun and also the top speed and also a couple of other things like your view range. I think it will be a worse version, although you do get better dispersion, so dispersion won't be as bad on this thing. Definitely don't want to be running the smaller gun because you literally sacrifice pretty much just your penetration for that. So make sure you use the top gun on this thing, and also you might need to fire some premium when you come up against some tier 10s, but luckily you have 242mm of penetration, which isn't too bad. So yeah, it's gonna be an interesting tank to play, and certainly one that kind of looks cool. The one problem that the Progetto C55 has is that the turret armor is nowhere near as strong as on the Bisante. It's a lot flatter, it's got no spaced armor, which means that people are going to be able to pen you more reliably through the front of the turret than in the Bisante. You do have a pretty poor upper plate of only 190mm of penetration to be able to go through that, which most people's premium rounds will go straight through. Don't even have to joke about that. And the lower plate is pretty poor as well, with only 160mm of it. So be careful when you're coming over a ridgeline, because people will shoot up into this, making it even worse. Be careful when you're shooting it though, because there is a bar which is way stronger than anything else that you'll be shooting on the hull of the tank. Side armor, as with the rest of them, is absolutely terrible. As with the side of the turret, you don't really want to be going side on to anyone at all. I mean, you shouldn't really in any tank, but you definitely don't want to be even angling too much in this tank, because they will just go through the side of you. Like at these sort of angles, they can still go through the side of your tank. So be careful if you try and do that. Now, in terms of moving on, we are going to move on to the tier 9 tank now and have a look at that. we've got a decent amount of DPM now. We've got an increase over the Bisante and also the Progetto C55. You've got an increase in alpha damage. You've also got a fairly meaty intro clip of 3.5 seconds. The aim time's alright. Dispersion is really nice on this tank. I think this is where they start to get a little bit better. You've got 9 degrees of gun depression, which is actually okay. You've got a 45 km/h top speed. Your power to weight goes down a little bit, so you're not going to be as mobile as the tier 8 tech tree one. And your armor gets a slight buff over the tier 8 as well. So in terms of this tank, what are you going to have? You're going to have this turret, which is fairly well angled on the cheeks of it. However, the bits just to the side of the mantlet are fairly weak, as well as the mantlet itself being quite weak. Don't really want to be firing heat at the mantlet because it is spaced armor, so watch out for that. But these cheeks can definitely be penned really easily. Cupola on this tank doesn't really have any, so don't really look at that unless you've got a really massive gun like a 183 where you can overmatch the top of the turret. In terms of the hull armor, you've got a decent upper plate, I guess, against like tier 7s maybe, but against tier 8s and 9s and 10s you're not really going to be able to bounce very much, especially if they're above you. Makes this thing paper, and the lower plate is also not particularly amazing. Better than the previous tanks, but certainly tier 8s, 9s and 10s will be able to go through this really reliably. Now, in terms of the gun handling, obviously it's a little bit better. Obviously the gun's going to get better as you go up the tiers, and you can actually put out some decent amount of damage, I guess, in this thing comparatively. Is it the best tier 9 heavy? Probably not, in my opinion. You've got decent view range. It means you can get some assistance damage, so you can get those combined totals up. So I think that these are a good shout for someone that's a bit bored of playing the traditional tanks in the game and you want to move on to something a little bit more interesting. Then finally at tier 10 we have the Rinocerante. This is the tier 10, obviously Italian heavy. This thing's, gets even slower. You've got a worse top speed of only 40 km/h. You do get a little bit better turret armor though than some other auto-loading heavy tanks at the tier. You've got 390 meters view range. It has an increase from the tier 9. You've got a little bit more hit points in this thing. You've got an extra like 50 hit points, or 150 hit points even. You've got a decent gun, 490 alpha, 3 in the clip, meaning you can deal a total clip damage of 1,470 in total. 4 in the clip, which is nice, or 4-second entry clip even, and a 1.92 second aim time with 0.32 dispersion. So the gun handling gets so much better on this tank than the previous one, and you certainly can have some more consistent games in this thing. You've got 10 degrees of gun depression, which is really nice for using on ridgelines. We'll have a look at that in just a second in terms of the visual model and what sort of armor profile you'll have. So as with the other Italian heavy tanks, you will want to be using this thing on ridgelines because that's where they're best suited. You can see that they actually have quite nice effective armor here, and especially when you use your full 10 degrees of gun depression that you do get, you can see that the armor profile gets really, really good with this thing, and it's going to be very, very hard for people to pen you reliably, especially if you're wiggling side to side as you can do in this thing, making it even harder for them to aim at the weakest point of your turret, and they're more than likely might even hit into the mantlet, which is going to be a pain. You'll actually find that the mantlet is actually kind of the worst piece of armor on the turret, so you can actually pen it through the side. If you see here, this is the weakest point with only 60mm of effective armor comparatively. The lower plate and hull armor is fairly weak in this thing, I guess. The lower plate is really, really small, so if you're actually facing it, you're going to be having a little bit of a hard time to be able to make sure you're hitting that, as opposed to this plate here that is quite strong actually, with about 300mm depending on where you're hitting it. So make sure that you are actually aiming at the lower plate and not this bar here. Or additionally, you could just pen through the upper plate with 256mm plus of penetration. Obviously, if you're above this tank, I'd aim for the turret because that's a guaranteed pen with only 70mm on the top. Certainly a decent tank overall. I think you can certainly have some nice games in it. I don't think it's going to be awful, but I certainly don't think that these tanks are going to be necessarily game breaking. I think that they might actually be fairly balanced in the game, which is something that new tanks don't tend to be on World of Tanks console for sure, and also on World of Tanks PC and pretty much any of the versions of World of Tanks that we play. So what's my overall opinion? What do I think about the Italian heavy tank lines? I think that if you haven't played any autoloaders, these are going to be a little bit of a struggle for you. If you haven't played the Italian auto reloaders, they might be interesting mechanic for you to play if you kind of know how to play an autoloader. As a new player, I definitely wouldn't recommend focusing your time on this tank line. I'd go something like the T57 Heavy. It's just got that massive boost to DPM for sure on a tank. When you look at the T57 Heavy tank, this thing gets way more DPM, just over 1,300 more. So you've got so much more DPM, you're more likely to enjoy the line going up to it, and it certainly is a little bit easier to play in my opinion. You've got less intra-clip reload, you've got better clip size, you've got a bigger clip potential, and yeah, I think that that's the line I'd recommend to new players wanting to get into autoloaders and auto reloaders. Other than that, I hope this overview was actually decent for you and you learnt a few things in terms of what you can expect from the tanks coming into the game. Which ones are the best one? Obviously, in my opinion, I think the tier 10 is going to be the best out of the tier 9 and 10. In terms of the lower tier ones, I'd recommend the Bisante. I think that's going to be better than the equivalent tier 8 and the tier 7 obviously. I think when you get to tier 9 and 10, that's when they start to get a little bit better and you can start using them a little more effectively. Certainly the Rinocerante tier for tier is probably better than the Progetto C50. For you guys that are interested in which ones I think you should be focusing on, and if you want to play them for a long period of time, then I'd recommend the Rinocerante as the tank of my choice. Now that's it for today's video. I hope you guys did enjoy. Let me know what you thought in the comment section down below, and if you wanted to carry on watching some other content, then you can do so on screen right now. If you want to subscribe to the channel, you can do so down below as well. That will be really helpful. Obviously, it will keep you up to date with the latest news on World of Tanks console, as well as give some guides, gameplay, that sort of thing, discussion videos, suggestion videos, and anything relating to the game that we all play. Other than that, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you in the next video. Goodbye.